My name is John Passfield, and the title of this reading will be Glenn Gould, Video 10, The Final Concert. So this is my novel, Glenn Gould, Light and Dark, a novel by John Passfield. And here's the summary on the back cover. Glenn Gould's life as a musician begins as a fairy tale. As the very first recording, the Goldberg Variation skyrockets the young Canadian to the top of the music world as a must-see and must-hear concert pianist with sold-out performances all around the world. And then, at the height of his powers and his popularity, he makes a decision about his music and his life, which splits the music world right down the middle and remains controversial to this day. Well, this novel is not the tragedy of Glenn Gould, although it might have been if he had not been an artist with a very clear sense of both the right and the wrong career paths that lay ahead of him. T.S. Eliot said that the great eras of art in his field, literature, did not have more talent than the lesser eras, but did have more talent that was well managed. And we might add, in the case of Glenn Gould, self-managed. This is the chapter 5 of 16 chapters, in which Glenn Gould makes a decision that splits the music world right down the middle. Okay, chapter 5. I'll get page 37 here, and we'll have a look. Okay, this is the chapter in which he changes his life. He's a concert pianist. He tours the world. He's highly welcome. People pay good money to see him, to hear him. And he plays the pieces they want to hear, the same familiar pieces over and over again. Okay, so I'm going to read 8 sections from this chapter. All my chapters have 8 sections of action. In between, they have 7 sections of deepening imagery. I'm only going to read the action. It's all in the mind, though, of the main character, Glenn Gould. At the University of Kentucky, a cavernous concert hall, 7,000 people crammed into the seats. Some of them are sitting in the aisles. An image in his mind, in Glenn Gould's mind. Teenagers thrusting out autograph books and pens. Playing the Goldberg Variations, the hit record they all came to hear, loathing every note I play. Doing all the things I despise in concert performance. Trills, octave doublings, pedal tricks. There is something about a crowd that always brings out the worst in me. I play to their reactions rather than playing as if I were alone. I always want them to respond in certain ways. I'm nervous, I'm fragile, I am not in control of myself. I am performing tricks for the man in the very last row, for the tired husband who would rather watch sports at a bar, for the wife who shows off her new pearls at a cultural event. I am winning them over at the expense of the music itself. So this realization about himself and his situation, the two don't go together, self and situation. What to do about it? Okay, a half page of deepening imagery we leave out. Waves of applause wash over me as I stand beside the piano. A wonderful evening, no doubt, for all but one person in the room. I am the only one here who could not write an ecstatic review. An image in his mind, a reporter hammering away at a battered typewriter. Competing with my recordings under conditions that make for music at a very low ebb. Competing noise, competing motives, competing thoughts, out of tune, spongy keyboard, an echo that muffles the sound, feeling as if I'm driving a runaway truck. I'm not just a concert performer. I'm just not a concert performer, sorry. I shall retire as soon as I can. I'd rather be alone in my cottage by the lake than have 7,000 people chanting my name. Well, not many people would say that, I'm sure. We leave out a page of deepening imagery again, and we go to the third of 8 sections of thought about action. Sitting down, writing a letter on the table in the cottage at Updergrove to my manager about the Australian tour. An image in his mind, a duck-billed platypus cartoon with a welcome sign. I don't want to go to Australia. I realize that they're giving me all of my conditions. I have no quarrel with the tour that you have set up. It is admirable how you have managed to protect my interests. I can appreciate how long you have spent in negotiations. The Australians have yielded on every point that I have made. The number of performances, receptions, interviews, speeches is exactly what you and I had agreed. I've always looked with favor on Australia. I was looking forward to Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, and Adelaide. However, now that the tour is final, in black and white, so to speak, I am convinced that I simply cannot go through with it. My tour of Europe led to my breakdown. I'm not clairvoyant, of course, but when I look over this schedule, I can see that something similar will inevitably happen again. My constitution will simply not endure the strain. The Australians, as you know, have been worried about my health. Just tell them that they are right to be concerned. Please tell them that I am canceling the tour. Okay, we leave out another page of imagery and go on to the fourth section of thought about action. Exhausted. My head back on a pillow. No more flying, but the train is just as depleting of my resources. An image in his mind, a schoolboy bending over and receiving the cane. Well, who's applying the cane? His agent. You know, Glenn, you can't just keep canceling every tour and every performance you don't want to do. There's going to come a point where you won't be invited anymore. Right now you're the king of the hill, but someday when you slip a little bit, or when people get tired of buying tickets and lining up just to be told you have a sniffle and won't be there, this magic castle that you built will melt away. These impresarios are not doing this for your benefit, you know. The maestros have their own careers to tend. Right now, you're still a lifeboat in the water for classical music, but when they see you start to sink, they'll swim away. Well, that's his manager giving him advice. Another page of deepening imagery we leave out, and then the fifth section here of thought. A need to find time to think and to write and to develop a response to the entire classical music repertoire. I will never find time while I'm on the concert circuit. I will never find time while running to catch a train. An image in his mind, trays shaking and a drink spilling on an airplane. When does Van Cliburn get time to think? When does Van Cliburn study the corpus of obscure works? When does he sit back and let the well fill up again? And George Zell and Leonard Bernstein, how do they cope with so many demands? Maestro Bernstein chomps on a sandwich as the cellist adjusts her strings. Maestro Zell does stand-up comedy to keep the orchestra loose during delays. I often wonder, when water enters a pond, does some of it sink down and mix and mingle and mature before moving on? Does some of it simply flow across the surface and go trippingly, shallowly, blithely on its way? Glenn Gould and Glenn Van Cliburn, two piano-playing, train-chasing, page problem here. So Glenn Gould and Van Cliburn, two piano-playing, train-chasing, airplane-hopping pliers of the concert circuit trade. Glenn Gould or Van Cliburn, which is which? The darlings of all the Russias in successive years. Mickey and Judy putting on a show in the barn. Pay your penny and watch the piano player play. Well, that's how he feels. We leave out another page and we go on to number 6 in terms of action. On a train between Toronto and New York, better than taking an airplane, less fear of catastrophe, and more unscheduled time to think. My head against the pillow, the clicking of the rails is music to me. An image? Group of boys throwing snowballs at a statue. I want to be less of a celebrity, less praised, less revered, less deferred to, less worshipped. I don't want to hear that my music has saved anyone's life. If I'm honest with myself, less criticized, less denounced, less vilified, less condemned, less demonized. I don't want to hear that I should be tending the sacred flame. I just want to be a person in the round. Okay, then we go on to, leaving out another page of deepening imagery, on to the 7th segment of action. Reading a book in an empty waiting room, recommended by a friend. An image in his mind, a pair of crutches on a peg on a ski shanty door. A boy on the side of a mountain, not in a valley, not on the top. Life in the mountain for those who do not ski. Dense fog, brilliant sunshine, driving rain. A balcony from which to view the world. Every feature covered in a blanket of clean, white snow. The sound of hooves in the clear, brisk air. The latest news in the dining room. Every day stitched to another by surgical thread. Is it possible to take one's own temperature? Is it possible to take one's own x-ray? 700 pages of waiting for life to begin. Well, that book will be thought about in more detail by Glenn Gould within the novel, which of course is 50,000 words of thought in the mind of Glenn Gould. Okay, we skip half a page of imagery and go to the final segment in this chapter. On stage at the Wilshire Ebel Theater in Los Angeles, a concert that I canceled earlier this year. The Art of the Fugue, Bach's Partita No. 4 in D major, Beethoven's Opus 109, Hindemith's Third Sonata. An image in his mind, a baggy pants vaudevillian with hat and cane. Concentrating on all the wrong things, not the joy in the work, not the perfection of the sound, but simply trying to avoid making any mistakes. I didn't want to do this performance. This is not the best use of my time. It is like playing in a museum for the portraits on the walls. So many things I want to do. Time is the only thing I own. I want to do more work like the Schoenberg documentary. I want to make programs for radio and television. I want to bring people into the music. I want some time for thinking. I want some time for writing. I want some time for simply being me. The final note of the extravaganza, a wall of loud applause, a couple of encores, and I will be free to walk away. I've been predicting my end since my beginning. Sails are billowing in the harbor. I have my ticket in my hand. Has this been the final performance of my career? So getting close to retirement, if not already there. Retirement at 2345. Okay. Here's a note that I wrote while reading this over, getting ready for this recording. What exactly is contained in my planning notebooks and reflective journals, which I offer for free access on my website in each of these video presentations? Well, each is about a specific writing project that I have done. Each planning notebook is about the writing process of a particular novel or novella, and each reflective journal is an assessment of that process. Each journal asks 2 questions. 1, what have I accomplished in writing this particular book and in my writing career so far? And number 2, where can and should I go in my writing from here? My planning notebooks and journals are not confessional. I realized when I read the journals of Virginia Woolf and the letters of such writers as Conrad that some writers pour out their hearts either to themselves in writing a notebook or a journal, or to others in writing letters and recounting the difficulties that they face in writing their fictional works. Well, I too have faced difficulties, which I'll explain in a moment. But I decided that if I were to pour my heart out in my planning notebooks and journals, I would find it so debilitating that I would stop writing. So, my notebooks and journals contain what I would consider to be 2 complementary things. Number 1, the nuts and bolts of the techniques by which I write my novels, and number 2, the literary theories which govern not only the choice of existing techniques, but the development of new techniques for the writing of my novels and novellas. Well, okay. What was it that caused me such anxiety and would have been worsened had I written any of it down? Simply this, that I was developing a new kind of novel, the poetic novel for our time, and I was getting further and further away from the traditional novel of our time, which is the prose novel. It was frustrating to me, not so much that publishers turned me down, I expected many of them to do so, but that they did not recommend an obscure publisher whom they knew to be interested in the kind of book that I was writing. It was obvious to me that they didn't do so because they had no idea that I was doing anything other than failing to write a good, solid prose novel. They didn't seem to recognize that there was a tradition behind me, which I feel is best exemplified by the modernist novel of the 1900 to 1930 era. This was disappointing, but on top of that, I kept getting ideas for novels that pleased me as future projects, but that I knew would lead me further and further away from the possibility of having my novels published. Well, not having one's novels published means that one will have no reviewers and no readers, and that prospect was threatening to be debilitating in itself. At the time of the planning of my 10th novel, Raskolnikov, Murder with an Axe, here it is, Raskolnikov, Murder with an Axe, a novel by John Passfield, I realized that this would be a novel that was going to have many strikes against it, 2 of which were, number 1, that it would be based on a classic. Who would dare to rewrite a classic novel? Who would want to read a second-best version of Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky? Well, I thought that if I took that big, fat, beautiful novel, I really admire it, and boiled it down, compressed the imagery, I would have what I wanted, which is the poetic novel for my time. So that's why I was going to do it. But who would want to read it? That it would be written in an even more extreme version of a novel form that I was developing, which I would now characterize as the interlayering of deepening imagery between layers of surface action. So I used to get up in the morning and write this novel, Raskolnikov, Murder with an Axe. I'd have 2 questions in mind. Who would want to read this novel when it's finished? And who would be able to read it? Well, you know what the answers were? Me. I would want to read it. I would be able to read it. So anyway, what to do? Well, I made 2 decisions. Number 1, to continue my practice of never writing of the threat of despair that constantly hovered over me as I proceeded through the course of my writing career. And number 2, to renew the vow that I made when I retired from teaching and became a writer, to write the best books that I could possibly write, no matter what the consequences. Well, as I mentioned, Raskolnikov, Murder with an Axe was my 10th novel. Recently, I completed my 29th novel, so I just hold it up. It's complete, it's finished, it's polished, it's not published. Here it is, Shakespeare and Cleopatra, My Life is Not My Own, a novel by John Passfield, a mummy with a brown eye and a blue eye, one for Cleopatra, one for Shakespeare. So that is complete, waiting to be published. And even more recently, I completed my 5th novella. Here it is. There it is there. John and Mother Goose, A Carnival of Tales, a novella by John Passfield, for a total of 34 creative books. I have a publisher for whom I'm deeply grateful, David Stover of Rocks Mills Press, because he publishes my novels as I send them to him, word for word. I have no reviewers of which I'm aware, and I have very few readers. What I have, though, is very precious to me. Thoreau once told a person that he had a very large shelf full of books in his cabin, most of which he'd written himself. They were multiple copies of a single book which had failed to sell. Well, I can say that I'm in the very same position. I have many books in my house which haven't sold very well, but what makes me feel very pleased is that I wrote them all myself, and they're exactly the books that I wanted to write. So perhaps that's enough confessional lamentation for now. Glenn Gould, Light and Dark, a novel by John Passfield, available on Amazon, available at roxmillspress.com with more information, and available on my website, johnpassfield.ca, where there's a planning notebook and a journal available for free access if you want to have a look. Lastly, I'll just say thank you for watching this video.